Continuing our discussion on attempting to apply theories to genocide, I'd like to pick up with the social learning differential association perspective. This is basically a very popular model that's used to explain all kinds of behaviors, and this is based on the idea that we learn from others, that we learn the methods, the motivations, and the rationalizations from others for particular behaviors. And according to Sutherland and Cressy, what we have here is the whole idea that criminal behavior is learned basically through the socialization process. And so we have behavior being learned through interaction in personal groups, and some of the same principles of behaviorism apply here in that sense, that people are rewarded and punished for certain behaviors, and certain behaviors are encouraged or discouraged, although this model doesn't explain what happens when behavior occurs that's not learned in groups, and also, it doesn't really explain the initial motivation to become violent. But one of the interesting aspects of that whole idea, and I started thinking about this more, this perspective is applied in child abuse and neglect research, is the intergenerational transmission theory, that abuse is kind of transmitted from one generation to the next through the social learning process. And what I would have to wonder here, we'd ask, well, is genocide transmitted from one generation to another? And we'll see there is indeed a few cases where we might see that being the case, but then there are many cases where that does not seem to apply. But the whole idea here is that if genocidal behavior is learned, then genocidal behavior can be unlearned. The next perspective or theory, exchange theory, basically focuses on rewards and costs. And we ask the question here, what do the genocide perpetrators have to gain, and what do they have to lose? So even though this is a narrow theory, one of the interesting features is that the genocidal leaders will do a cost-benefit analysis of their behavior. For example, if they have seen other perpetrators engage in violent behavior without repercussions, then they may go ahead and do that. And so one of the things here is looking at, if we had the International Criminal Court really applying sanctions and the international community not tolerating genocidal behavior, it might decrease because the leaders and the group would realize that the costs are too high. So this idea here is, if you want to decrease genocide, make the costs to the perpetrators extremely high. And maybe that would help reduce genocide. The next model is kind of called by Neil Kressel the power of the situation, and he based that on Milgram's studies, where that Milgram recruited people for a psychology experiment, and basically had the experimenter instruct the participants to shock people when they were trying to learn words, and what he found was that that a large proportion of people would go ahead and shock the victims who were behind a screen, even when they screamed out in pain or stopped screaming, as if they had passed out or maybe even died. And these people seemed to be okay. They were stressed by the situation, but having this dude in a lab coat with doctor before his name saying, nope, you must continue the study, keep on turning up the shock machine. Of course, the subjects that were getting shocked really were not. They were acting, and they were in on this experiment. But the idea here is that this wasn't necessarily aggression, but it was obedience. And again, this kind of gets to the whole idea, do we see some of those that follow the genocidal leaders as caught up in the power of the situation? Excuse me. And so here we begin to look at how certain situations may lead to abuse and violence and homicide. So this theory, again, is very useful, but I think it needs closer analysis as it relates to to genocide. Here we ask the question, why do people go along with violent groups, join violent groups, become part of violent groups, and then carry out violent activities? In my own research, I have an analysis of 2 perpetrators, one that killed 70 people, but he was caught up in the power of the situation and he admitted his guilt. He apologized. He said that he was forced to do that or he would have been killed. And then I have another case of a perpetrator who seemed to enjoy harming and torturing others. And with the power of the situation, also we realize that there's no negative consequences for the violent behaviors. And in fact, there may be negative consequences for disobeying orders to be violent. So this model is also very useful as well. Later on, we would see after Milgram's work, Zimbardo's mock prison studies demonstrated similar results. And this whole idea, Zimbardo created a mock prison, and with several days he had to end the experiment because the prison guards were abusing the prisoners, and this was seen as part of the power of the situation. So again, a very useful model, but I think we need to do a lot more work to apply it there. And then symbolic interactionist theory. Symbolic interactionism focuses on social interaction, the self, role-taking, and the meaning of symbols, and how we label activities and we label others, and we make sense of the world and ourselves. What I'd like to mention is that I usually use a symbolic interactionist perspective in my own work. So I have a bias favorable towards symbolic interactionism, and I think it's important for me to mention my bias to you because it may come out in other videos and presentations. And I think all criminal justice professionals do have a primary theory that they believe is one of the more useful ones and that they use in their own research and practice. Mine happens to be symbolic interactionism. And so I just wanted to make that clear there. And symbolic interactionism, according to Bloomer, is based on the premise that people act based on meanings which are derived from interaction with others and then are interpreted by the individual. So this is a very interpretive model as well. And it's more of a micro model, looking at how small groups can change and begin to develop violent thought processes and behaviors. One of the criticisms of this model is that it ignores social structure and power, and also doesn't explain the motivation to initially participate in genocide. But what I would say regarding this is that a sociologist by the name of Lonnie Athens actually has brought a new symbolic interactionist perspective where he does analyze social structure and power. So here and we'll talk about this later when we talk about the work of Lonnie Athens and applying his work to genocide, that we do see domination as a central theme there, and that seems to be a very useful perspective to apply to genocides. And this wraps up this video. Thank you.